And now it's my privilege to position our first panel on democratic deconsolidation and to introduce its moderator, faculty colleague, renowned political scientist Jeffrey Isaac, James H. Rudy Professor at Indiana University. Jeff served as editor-in-chief of Perspectives on Politics, a flagship journal of the American Political Science Association from 2009 to 2017. And in 2017, he was awarded the APSA's Frank J. Goodnow Award for Distinguished Public Service to the profession for his work. You have his bio in your program, so you know he has a distinguished record of publications, including Democracy in Dark Times, and he's a contributing editor of Dissent magazine. I can't think of anybody better to lead this discussion. Welcome, Jeff, and over to you.
Thank you. Is the entire panel going to come up? So, welcome. We're going to have a discussion that I will moderate, and I'll sit down in a second and then say a few words and introduce our distinguished panelists. I guess I should start by thanking you all for coming and thanking Lee and also Emily and the entire staff. I know Yael has worked a lot on this conference as well. Thank them all for organizing this conference. It's my pleasure to be here. And our first panel is on the topic of democratic deconsolidation. And we'll be talking about what that means and whether or not that's something that should be of great concern to us, and to the extent that it should be, what could be done about it. I thought I'd start just with some props by way of a very brief introduction. I plan to not do that much talking here, and we have people who are prepared to speak more, although the format we have planned is a conversation. So you may have seen some of these things. The New Republic, Can Democracy Survive? Which is about, this headline is a reference to a book called How Democracies Die, written by political scientists at Harvard, colleagues of Yascha, Daniel Zyblatt and Stephen Levitsky. From the New York Times, How Stable Are Democracies? Warning Signs Are Flashing Red. From The Economist, What's Gone Wrong with Democracy? Is there a crisis of democracy? Actually, I wrote this. a very important piece. From The New Yorker, by the way, a lot of these pieces discuss some of our colleagues here. Yascha's book in particular has gotten a lot of attention on these very topics. David Remnick in a recent New Yorker, Donald Trump and the Stress Test of Liberal Democracy. From the Boston Review, a symposium led off by an article by Ira Katznelson, a very distinguished political scientist and former president of the Social Science Research Council, Anxieties of Democracy. Finally, the Freedom House 2018 report on freedom in the world, which has this really interesting, if any of you have seen it, Michael's going to talk about it, this interesting graphic. I think that's Wonder Woman carrying a banner called Democracy and Human Rights. And then there are a bunch of benighted, like, democratic states here. It's not clear what they're doing exactly, but what's clear is that there's a kind of heavy-set guy here with looking at his cell phone with, like, orangey type hair. He looks a lot like the occupant of the Oval Office. And you can talk about what that means, but actually in a piece that he wrote very recently, he described for himself, we looked at the state of democracy around the world, and the results are grim. And I have other props too, but I think I'm just going to cut this short. Finally, we have Yascha's book, The People versus Democracy.
That's the important prop.
And he looks exactly like he does in all these, like, promo photos. If he has this, like, one, yes, okay. How do you do that, actually? Well, whatever. Like, because it requires keeping the beard in a very particular kind of whatever. The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. So everywhere we look, by the way, all of these texts that I showed you, some of which you've probably seen or encountered, are from the past few months. But I'd say particularly in the past year, and certainly in the past 2 years, there's been extensive discussion about the question of whether and to what extent liberal democracy is in crisis. This is a terrific book by Edward Luce, The Retreat of Western Liberalism, which is about that as well, and what to do about it. It's a topic of concern to academics, and in journals like Journal of Democracy and other journals, including Perspectives on Politics, there are spaces where academics can talk in a meaningful way about these issues. There are issues of concern to policymakers, politicians, and also to ordinary citizens, although it's perhaps the case that there aren't as many ordinary citizens as concerned about this crisis as there should be. Or to put this another way, there are millions of ordinary citizens in every country that is a liberal democracy who, far from being concerned about the crisis of democracy, arguably are voting into office political leaders who are, in fact, exacerbating the crisis. I'm not characterizing them. I'm certainly not saying these people are deplorable or anything like that. But it is a fact that while we here might, at least for the sake of discussion, presume that there's a problem with democratic deconsolidation, the events and processes that concern us are events and processes that others, including our fellow citizens, welcome. And that's, I think, something we're thinking very hard about. So our framework here of discussion is, I'm already messed up with all of my stuff. Oh, here, this is good. Is to have a roundtable discussion. And what I'd like to do is introduce my panelists, our panelists, and then just tell you very briefly the kind of general charge that I offered to them, some general questions. They'll each speak for 5 minutes. Then it will be my job to moderate and hopefully also provoke further discussion, particularly disagreement among them. Because, and then
That won't be hard.
then there'll be a lot of time for audience participation. No, I should say that for concise questions or comments, very concise questions and comments from you. And we'll keep within the time limit of basically 75 minutes. So we have like 70 minutes left. Okay, so 4 wonderful panelists. I'm just going to read from their bios. Michael Abramowitz is president of Freedom House. Before joining Freedom House in February 2017, he was director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Levine Institute for Holocaust Education, and he worked for the Washington Post and lots of other things. Very interesting. I'm not going to say anything more about him. You will see for yourself how impressive he is. Serge Berensztein is doctor. Did I pronounce your last name properly?
Berensztein.
Berensztein, okay. Except I said Serge, and it's Sergio. I'm sorry. Is doctor and master in political science and Bachelor of History from University of North Carolina. He's chairman and CEO of Berensztein, a political and strategic analysis consultancy he founded in 2014 with a regional and comparative perspective using rigorous and innovative research methods. This is very important. He's very rigorous. We'll see how rigorous he is today. That was a very Trumpian comment I just made. I retract it. I retract it. Katie Simmons is Associate Director of Research at the Pew Research Center. She's an expert in survey methodology and conducts research on international public opinion on a variety of topics, including U.S. foreign policy, the global economy, democracy, and terrorism. She helps to coordinate the center-wide international research agenda and serves as a methodology consultant, also rigorous, on all international projects at the center. And both Freedom House and Pew have done important recent surveys or important state-of-the-world analyses that our commentators are going to talk about. And finally, Yascha Mounk is a writer, academic, and public speaker known for his work on the rise of populism and the crisis of liberal democracy. He's actually published 2 books this year. They're both really interesting. I only brought the one that's really most relevant to this, which is The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. And he's also written a book called Stranger in My Own Country, A Jewish Family in Modern Germany, which is a memoir. And he is affiliated with many institutions, His PhD is from the Harvard Government Department, and he's a lecturer in government at Harvard, right? He also writes for Slate. He has a podcast and does many other things. These people are all interesting people, and they're going to speak. I wrote to them a couple of weeks ago, and I told them that I'll briefly introduce you. I'll then ask each of you to speak briefly for 5 minutes on this set of questions. It's very brief. I'm going to read now the set of questions that I offered to them, and they'll respond in whatever way they want within their 5-minute time frame. The main question is, are we experiencing a crisis of liberal democracy, and is liberal democracy in danger of being deconsolidated, or is it already on a path of deconsolidation? And then there are 2 sub-questions. What do you consider the main challenges and opportunities confronting liberal democracy today? And secondly, what forces do you regard as posing the greatest dangers? And also, what forces do you regard as potential agents of improvement or even solution to the challenges or problems of liberal democracy today? So with that general introduction, I think we'll turn to our panelists, and each of them will speak in turn, and then we'll see what happens. Lee didn't say I'm also a jazz musician, and I'm like all about improvisation. So we'll just see what happens. And we haven't even discussed an order. Do you want to go first? We'll just come across this way?
Sure.
Okay.
So first of all, thank you, Geoff, for that. I don't know if it's a kind introduction. Certainly an interesting introduction, and it's really an honor to be here at IU, especially with Senator Lugar and Congressman Hamilton, 2 people I've deeply respected over my career, and also my friend Lee. Thank you for inviting me. I thought I would just start by saying a word about the founding of Freedom House, because I think it's a little bit relevant to the conversation today. Freedom House was founded in 1941. We're actually one of the oldest organizations in the country devoted to protecting and defending democracy. And Freedom House came about because a group of very concerned citizens were very concerned about American isolationism in the late 30s and early 40s. And they were particularly concerned about the America First movement. That was really the organizing principle of Freedom House. And it just shows that history has a strange way of coming round. And Freedom House was organized under the patronage, if you will, of Eleanor Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie, who had run against Eleanor's husband in 1940 for president. And I just find that incredibly inspiring to think about, that there was an organization that could bring together, under that broad kind of political spectrum, a group of people who are fiercely devoted to the principles of liberal democracy and the core components of liberal democracy. And I would say 77 years later, that is still our focus. And it's strange to me, I took over at Freedom House about 14 months ago, that we were once again confronting the idea of America First. So that's just one point I wanted to make. I thought I would just take a couple minutes to talk about the issue of, is democracy in crisis? I think it's going to be hard to answer all 3 things. But I would argue, we've used the word in the report that you so kindly held up, and I would sort of say yes. And why do I say that? I think there are about 4 or 5 different things that I would point to kind of get the conversation going. Number 1, we've been reviewing the state of democracy in the world for almost 50 years. We are now in a period of about 12 years, which is which I think Larry Diamond, a political scientist at Stanford, has called a democracy recession. 12 consecutive years of basically downward scores in our ratings of countries' political rights and civil liberties. So just for instance, in this year's report, about 70 countries experienced declines in political rights, freedom of the press, freedom of association, freedom of religion, and less than half experienced improvements. So this is the 12th consecutive year that's happened, and so I think that's a major problem. I would say, though, that the scores themselves, there's also qualitative things that I would consider. I think it's the nature of the countries that are really falling, that are really experiencing erosion. A country that I think about a lot would be the country of Turkey. This is a country that has had the largest single drop in our democracy scores over the last 10 years. And it's now, actually this year it moved, we have these 3 broad categories. It's moved from partly free to not free. Civil society has been crushed. Dozens of journalists are in jail. Hundreds of putative people who are opposed to the government there are in jail. And I think, if you look around the world, the kinds of countries that are experiencing erosion are quite concerning. Poland and Hungary in Europe, Venezuela in the southern hemisphere, the Philippines. So these are really significant countries. So I think the kinds of countries that are experiencing democratic erosion is quite concerning. I would also say the role of China and Russia, much different than it was 15 or 20 years ago. I think certainly in the case of China, we had sort of had the hope, many in the West, that China would become more liberal, but that's not been the case. They're obviously a huge success economically, but under a really authoritarian rubric. And Russia itself has now become, as your panel later is, an active opponent of democracy, not just within its borders, but as you saw with our elections in 2016, beyond its borders. So I think those are 3 things that I would point to say that democracy is in crisis. I think the final thing is, it's hard to kind of quantify this, but I do believe that this is something that we have to think about, that there is a counter-narrative now. 25, 30 years ago, when I grew up in the shadow, there was no dispute. We just took it for granted that democracy and liberal democracy was the wave of the future. And I think that idea is now under strong challenge. And one of the things that I have the benefit of doing when you're the president of Freedom House is foreign ministers or people come to complain about the scores they get from us, and that's and one of the, and I
like undergraduates.
Yes, but well, the first week I was there, I had the foreign minister of Ukraine who was upset with us. I was like, "What's this about?" But I think what was clear to me from some of these conversations is that I think that the idea that the values that we hold dear, freedom of the press, freedom of association, are less important in some of these countries, and the idea of stability and order. And I think we have a lot of work to do that's cut out for us at Freedom House and among others to really make the case for why liberal democracy is important and the way to go. I'll stop there. Did I do 5 minutes?
Exactly. I was going to give you 2 extra minutes, actually. Okay. I shouldn't say that to the other, but yeah, perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sergio, you want to go next? Would you like it?
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I am from Argentina. I cover Latin America, and democracy is indeed in crisis. So welcome to the club. That's what we do. And so it's interesting to talk about deconsolidation because that assumes that democracy was indeed consolidated. When you look at the Latin American experience, that was not the case. It was never consolidated. And so I think I can use my time to draw a couple of lessons from our experience in the last 3 decades or so. It's important to focus on democratic institutions, political parties, electoral regimes, etc., because that's the way we elect our leaders, right? But remember that most of people's demands are about the quality of institutions as regards to the state apparatus. Not so much democracy as we select people, but rather the capacity to provide public goods. Safety, access to justice, education, healthcare, environment, infrastructure. Right? Those are most of the demands that today countries are unable to get to the people, and you get a lot of conflicts because of that. But this not has to do with democracy itself. It's rather a problem of state capacity, right? And so that brings the question of the fiscal sustainability of our modern states, right? The issue of job creation in the context of this huge technological shock we're living. And so this is one of the main lessons I think we can draw from the Latin American experience. The second lesson is the issue of corruption. Which is indeed a way to look at institutions or the fragility of institutions. So you look at now the situation in Latin America, we have a huge scandal involving a Brazilian construction company, Odebrecht, that was all over the place. And this is in the years of the expansion of President Lula and his leadership in the region. And so you have corruption scandals from Mexico South, everywhere, right? With probably the exception of Paraguay, because other Brecs thought that Paraguay was too corrupt for them. But other than that, they've been all over the place. So you look at corruption, and it's really a way to create lack of confidence in the people. And this is, I think, the other issue that we can learn from the American experience. The lack of confidence in politicians, first, on institutions later, is one of the most pervasive issues, particularly regarding the third issue, the justice system. You look at the justice system in the region, and historically have been entrenched in the most important elites, and so the perception that it's not a just way to settle conflicts, particularly power and political conflicts, another interesting lesson. Last but not least, when you look at institutions, we have fragility, but then we have a vibrant civil society. And you guys also have that in the States and elsewhere in Europe. I mean, you have all these kids complaining now about the access to weapons. You have the Me Too movement. This is also part of democracy. So you may have erosion of institutions and confidence, but on the other hand, you have a vibrant civil society sort of compensating for that. So you have that in an American's way, and sometimes big changes are the result of this interaction between established powers and society that eventually creates new events. And I think you should also focus on that when assessing the crisis of democracy.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. By the way, I just noticed here that there's a little timer. This is awesome. I didn't even know this existed. You didn't tell me about this. 5 minutes. There you go.
Okay, I will meet
Katie
my
Simmons.
time. I'm quick. So I work at the Pew Research Center, and I'll just talk a little bit about our mission and what I work on there, and then get to a couple main points from our research. So the Pew Research Center is nonpartisan and non-advocacy, so we don't take positions. Our mission is to provide facts to the public and policymakers to help inform decision-making. So as part of that, we do an annual survey of global attitudes around the world on a range of issues. And that's what I'll be talking about today, is our 2017 Global Attitudes Survey, where we did an investigation into people's attitudes about different forms of governance and their attitudes about their democracy. And I think one of the things that we can contribute is public opinion really highlights this contradiction or conflict that we've been talking about so far between support for principles of democracy, but also people's attitudes about whether democracy delivers for them or not, whether they're getting the sort of services and things that they need from their democratic institutions, and then what this means for support for democracy as a form of governance. So we did a survey of 38 countries around the world, and we found sort of 3 key things. One, there's very broad support for democracy, representative democracy around the world. A median of 78% across our 38 countries say representative democracy is a good way to govern their country. In 2015, we did a similar survey where we asked about the different principles of democracy, protecting freedom of religion, honest elections, free speech, and you find widespread support for those principles. At the same time, we also find significant pockets of support for some of the non-democratic forms of governance that we asked about. 49% say government by experts would be a good way to go. 26% say government by a strong leader who doesn't have to deal with interference from parliaments or courts would be a good way to go. And then 24% say military rule would be a good thing. So very much a sort of contradiction between both supporting representative democracy but also considering some of the non-democratic forms. So what we do find is a very clear pattern that economics matters. So people who are dissatisfied with the way their democracy is working are more likely to say representative democracy is a bad way to govern their country. And what we find is a very consistent pattern where people who have experienced lower economic growth or perceive that their country's economy is not doing well are more dissatisfied with how their democracy is working, and therefore are less supportive of a representative democracy. Another challenge that we've seen to potentially liberal democracy is some of the supporters of right-wing populist parties in Western Europe. So what we find in our data is not that people who support right-wing populist parties are necessarily anti-democratic. They do, broad majorities of them say representative democracy is good. But they are also very supportive of what we asked about in terms of direct democracy, so having citizens vote directly on major issues and major laws. And so this raises the question of what kind of democracy are they supporting, and what do they want? So it suggests to us that they want more of a voice in their government. But what do they think about in terms of majoritarian rule versus protection of minority rights or minority voice in government? And what's the trade-off between those two things? And that's sort of a question that remains to be seen that we're still going to investigate in future surveys.
Thank you. I should say before Yascha speaks, I failed as a moderator in maybe many respects, but at least one, which is that the title of our panel about democratic deconsolidation comes from a piece that Yascha and his colleague published in Journal of Democracy in 2016. I don't think they actually coined this term, and in fact, as far back as 2003, Charles Tilly wrote about de-democratization. But they wrote a very important piece that has received a lot of attention. And maybe I should have also asked him to go first for that reason. But in any case, go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Thanks. Well, first of all, I've met many distinguished people who grew up and have roots in Indiana in my life, some dear friends, and one of my advisors and mentors, the great moral philosopher Tim Scanlon. But it's actually the first time that I am in the state of Indiana. So it's a pleasure to be here, and it's all the nicer to meet some of the most distinguished people in the state of Indiana, like Senator Lugar and others on my first trip here. I think I may be getting an overly rosy picture of your state. It is also a pleasure. I think, Geoff, I'm going to correct you. I think I did, in fact, coin that term together with Rob. There were sort of different, similar terms before. So that's a new experience for me as well. I've never been on a panel that's been sort of named after a word I made up. But why is that a sensible term? Why does it make sense to speak to that? Well, I think that the panelists who went before me have done a great job sort of bringing that out. I want to sort of tie those threads together a little bit, right? So what we're seeing is all of those countries moving away from democracy rather than towards it. For the last 12 years, we've been in this democratic recession with more countries falling on the democracy scores than rising on the democracy scores by a wide margin. We see some of this really worrying data about people's attitudes, about how they feel about the system of government. So let's put this in this wider context of how political scientists, but also journalists, politicians, ordinary citizens have long thought about their democracies. And the basic picture, I think, was to say, look, we know that some poor democracies can die, right? It's not surprising that a country like Kenya is currently struggling for its democracy. It's a tragedy, but it's not surprising, because poor democracies have always struggled. It's not surprising that some authoritarian countries that might continue to have stable authoritarian government. We've known that throughout history. What we did assume was that once a country had changed government with free and fair elections a whole bunch of times, once it was reasonably affluent, more than about $14,000, $15,000 GDP per capita in today's terms, it seemed to be safe. We did not have a single example in history of a country like that where democracy had failed. And so we came up in the literature with this term called democratic consolidation. And the idea was that this was a one-way street, that once you established these democratic institutions, once you became affluent, you really didn't have to worry. Well, long before our current president and long before the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union and so on, with a colleague, Roberto Foer, we started to question that consensus and asking whether a process of democratic deconsolidation may not be going on. And we had sort of three pieces of evidence for that. If you assume that democracy has become the only game in town, you should think that most citizens strongly support democracy, that very few of them are open to democratic and to authoritarian alternatives to democracy, and most importantly, that there's no major politicians and political parties that actually refuse to accept basic democratic rules and norms. Now, as we showed using World Value Studies data, at the time, over 2/3 of older Americans born in the 1930s and 1940s said that it's crucial to live in a democracy. Less than 1/3 of younger Americans born since 1980 did. About 1 in 16 Americans back in 1995 said that army rule was a good system of government. By the time we were writing that article, it was 1 in 6. And according to the Pew data that Katie presented, it's actually more than that now. And this is not just a trend in the United States, it's a trend in many countries around the world. Now, what is true is that majorities still say that they like democracy. But that's been the case in Venezuela before they elected Hugo Chavez. That is the case today in Russia. So you need a very broad and very fervent consensus around democratic values for democracy to survive. So I'm not quite as heartened as Katie is by the findings that, yeah, sure, even a majority of people who support populist parties like democracy at some abstract level, but if you don't have that deep consensus in society, the historical record suggests your democracy may be in very real danger. So let me say a couple of words about the nature of that danger, and that is about the kinds of politicians we've seen rising everywhere. It's a mistake to think about threats to democracy through the frame of the most famous case of democratic breakdown, which is the Weimar Republic. Normally, when democracies come under threat, it's not from people who openly oppose democracy, it's not from people who do the Hitler salute, it is not from people who wear big, shiny black boots and march through the center of town with torches. It is from people who say, hey, this system isn't working for you. Politicians are failing to deliver. Politics is actually quite simple. All we need is somebody who can truly speak for ordinary people, drain the swamp, get rid of all of these people, and that's me. I am your voice, so trust me. And once they are in power, they claim, in a phrase by one of our colleagues, Jan Werner Müller, an exclusive claim to the moral representation of the people. Only they truly represent the people, which means that if a political opposition tries to stop them from passing certain other laws, that's not a legitimate part of the political system. The opposition are traitors. If the press criticizes them, then that's not a normal part of a democratic system. That is fake news, and they need to be regulated and cowed. When judges rule against certain acts of parliament or acts of Congress, when independent institutions like the Department of Justice or the FBI do their work, that is not a normal part of the functioning of democracy. It is enemies of the people. So what's going on right now is not just that we see people being deeply disappointed with democratic institutions and having more critical views than we used to. It's not just, across the world, more countries moving away from democracy than moving towards it. It is the most supposedly consolidated and stable democracies in North America and Western Europe being challenged by an increasingly ideologically self-conscious alternative political form, which is represented by populists, whether they're on the far right, as I would argue in this country, or on the far left, as in Venezuela and to some degree in other Latin American countries. And that, to me, is the reason why democracy is in danger right now in a way that is unlike any previous point, certainly in my life.
Thank you. I wonder if maybe I could abet a little bit of conversation between the two of you, because at least in your presentation, and I think also in the report itself, and you began by saying you're about the facts, you don't have an ideological mission. I think it's fair to say that Yascha and also Michael, in terms of the language that they're using to describe the situation, are alarmed. I wouldn't say alarmist, but I would say alarmed. And there was no alarm in your presentation. In fact, both in terms of the way you presented the data, but also the data itself. Do you want to respond? Like, should we be as concerned as he is in general? And particularly, a very important part of Yascha's argument has been an interpretation of the declining support for democracy among younger generations. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that, Katie. I guess I do intend to put you on the spot. That's my job.
That's okay, I'm used to that. So I think to speak to a couple of things. So we do find, broad majorities say representative democracy is good, but we also wanted to look at it from another perspective because we did find so much significant support for some of the non-democratic options. So we put together a scale. Basically, we called it commitment to representative democracy. And what you do see there is very much what Yascha is talking about, is that the global median, in terms of the percentage of people who say representative democracy is good and all three non-democratic options are bad, is only 23%. It's higher in Europe and North America, but even still, in the United States, it's only roughly 40%. The highest is Sweden at 52%. The lowest is in Russia at 7%. So we find very low levels of people who are what we would call committed representative Democrats. One of the places that's very low is Latin America, roughly 20% in Latin America. A big part of that is the decline we've seen over the past 4 years in satisfaction with democracy in Latin America. There's a huge shift that we've seen in our public opinion data on that. This is one of the few places where we have trends. Unfortunately, we don't have trends on the governance question, so I can't speak to that change over time, though I wish I could. But in Latin America, the decline in satisfaction with democracy is in the double digits just over 4 years, 2013 to 2017. In Brazil, it went from 66% to 28% satisfied. So you see a very real impact of slowing economic growth, the corruption crises in these countries. And that means we see the lowest support for representative democracy in Latin America. It's just 58% compared to 78% around the rest of the world. So you do see, if you're looking at support for non-democratic options, looking at sort of low levels of intense commitment to representative democracy, that very much comes through in our data as well. In terms of the young people, we don't find as much sort of strong age difference in support for representative democracy, either through just the straight question on representative democracy or this commitment scale. We do find in some countries young people are more likely to support the expert rule, that experts taking charge of government would be a good thing. Young people are somewhat more likely to say that that's a good thing. Really, the demographic differences that we see in our data are by education and ideology. So lower educated people and people on the right of the ideological scale tend to be more supportive of strong leaders and tend to be more supportive of military government.
It's worth pointing out that Katie and Michael are both addressing a similar theme, in somewhat different ways methodologically. And Katie is really reporting on the results of Pew public opinion surveys. Yascha is also talking about the World Value Survey. The Freedom House scores and a number of these other types of scores that are developed they take account of public opinion, but they're really kind of expert-based assessments. Maybe you want to just say a little bit more about that, if you do, in response to what Katie said. Not necessarily the methodological question, but do you have anything to add to what Katie said, Michael?
No, I think that Katie and Yascha know the public opinion very well, so I don't think there's anything to add there. I would say that the issue of democracy is not just public opinion, and as we know from the example that Yascha started with, the example of the Weimar Republic, people can take power and do terrible things without widespread public support. And really the question is, I liked what Yascha had to say about the energy of commitment to democracy. It's one thing to say we're interested in democracy, we support it, but it's another thing to say, are you really going to defend it vigorously in the face of concerted attacks? We were talking about our country. There's been in the last year there's been unprecedented attacks on institutions, the media, the independent judiciary, other things. I'm not trying to say this from a partisan point of view, but what is a response to that? And are people, and I think certain people have stepped up and tried to. I'm very impressed. For instance, I used to be a reporter, and I think the media has generally acquitted itself pretty well in the face of those kind of attacks. And in fact, in our Freedom House scores this year, we marked down the U.S. in a couple of areas, but one was not in freedom of the press, because we saw on a global scale that the press had done quite a good job at reporting aggressively and continuing to do their job in the face of really the kind of attacks that we certainly haven't seen since the early 70s with the Nixon administration.
And so just to jump in on that, I think sort of both in what Mike was saying right now and what Katie was saying earlier, it's sort of implicit that it's worth thinking a little bit about why it is that we're seeing some of these developments and trends. And I think that there's a set of interrelated factors that you see in a bunch of countries around the world. Because if you're saying some of that public opinion data change, and the much more obvious radical change, which is the rise of these populist parties in different countries across the world. So I did a study recently that showed that the average vote share of populist parties in Europe was about 8% in the year 2000, and is about 25% now. They used to be in 7 governments. Now they're in 14 governments. Once Italy has somehow completed its complicated process of finding a government, it's probably going to be 15. You can today drive all the way down the cities that Winston Churchill mentioned in his famous Iron Curtain speech. You can start in Stettin in the Baltic Sea and go even further than he was talking about to Athens in the Aegean, and you're never going to leave a country ruled by populists. So this is no longer an insurgent force, it is actually a dominating one. So when you have that, I think it's worth looking at, well, you have all these developments going on, it must be a common set of causes. It's not a coincidence that each of these things is going on. I think sometimes in the United States, we tend to underplay that. We have a political figure right now in our country who is so fascinating and has so many interesting backstories to unfold, as we saw last Sunday, that we can become obsessed with him as a figure and miss the way in which he fits into this broader picture. So I think to understand why these opinions are turning, why these populists are rising, you need to look at least 3 factors. One of them is the stagnation of living standards for ordinary citizens, which is particularly acute in the United States, but which you see in many other countries as well. From 1935 to 1960, the living standard of the average American doubled. From 1960 to 1985, it doubled again. Since 1985, it's essentially flat. And that really changes how people think about politics. They used to say, look, I don't know that I trust politicians, these people in Washington, D.C., I'm not sure that they're exactly, But you know what? I'm twice as rich as my parents were. My kids are going to be twice as rich as me, so something seems to be working for me. In the end, they seem to be sticking to the end of a deal. So let's give them the benefit of a doubt. Now people are saying, hey, I've worked hard all my life. I'm not really any better off than my parents were. My kids are going to be worse off than me. Am I allowed to swear in this nice...
You're allowed to swear in a concise way, because I need to call on Sergio.
All right.
Just be quick about it.
Let's throw some shit against the wall and see what sticks. Let's try something new. How bad could things get? Right? The second thing is the complicated process of building an equal multi-ethnic society. European democracies were founded on a self-conception of being mono-ethnic and monocultural, in which it was quite clear to the average Swede or Italian or German in 1960 that the only people who truly belong are the ones who are descended from the same ethnic stock, and that somebody who's brown or black or Muslim or Hindu or Jewish doesn't really belong. Now, thankfully, that's changed. Legal conceptions have changed, attitudes have become more liberal, but there's also a strong rebellion against that by people, and we shouldn't be surprised by that, who have something to lose, because they used to have status advantages, material advantages, and those are now thankfully being challenged. But it's not a surprise that people are saying, hey, you're taking something away from me. Now, the United States in that count is both similar and different. It's different in that it's always been a multi-ethnic society, but it's similar in that it's always been a multi-ethnic society with very strict racial hierarchy. And so again, we've actually made great progress in overcoming that. I think there's no doubt that it's better to be a member of just about any minority in our country today than it was 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. It might have been better 2 years ago, but not 20 or 40 or 60 years ago, right? So we should celebrate, but again, we shouldn't be surprised by the fact that some of the people might feel like some of the privileges are being taken away from them, and that is a difficult political process to manage. Now, the third thing, I think, is the rise of social media. Because if you have people being disappointed with their economic status, and you have a fear of the cultural change in the country, and then you add the much greater ability for extreme voices to enter our politics, to bypass traditional gatekeepers, you get a pretty dangerous cocktail.
Sergio, great.
I think it's worth remembering that we have in less than 2 decades 3 great shocks. One is 9/11 and the aftermath, creating uncertainty globally, the issue of terrorism. The second is the Great Recession, all the deterioration of standard of living and the destruction of upper mobility mechanisms. It's a result of this recession. That is far from over. I mean, we still have central banks, issuing a lot of money to help the economy going, right? We don't know what's going to happen when the tapering mechanism starts. And last but not least, the revolution of technology, destroying jobs at an unusual rate. And we don't know what's next in terms of job creation. And so, of course, you have these new demands and all institutions dealing with new issues. And that's an important, I think, way to understand this sort of great inability by political system, established political system, to respond to new demands, particularly in the context of fiscal restrictions. I mean, look at Europe, right? Democracy in Europe is the result of the welfare state. The welfare state is now impossible to finance. It's impossible. You have fiscal crises all over the place. So the question is, what's next in terms of fiscal sustainability of big state apparatus that have trouble in reducing the size and in becoming more efficient, right? So remember, these three crises combined are creating new challenges, not just for democracy. I mean, you see same challenges even under authoritarian regimes. Remember, and authoritarian regimes or populist leaders are not more efficient than democratic ones. It's a matter of time until people realize that authoritarian regimes are not able or willing to deliver. Right?
This is a very important point. So the wonderful technologies of SGIS inform me that we have 31 minutes and 47 seconds left of our session. So our goal was to have time for questions and brief comments, hopefully questions for our panelists from the audience. I'm going to save 5 minutes at the very end to pose a big question to them again and allow them to sum up. But I think what we'll do now is thank them for their terrific, they're still staying here, their terrific comments, and now open it up to the floor for very concise questions. And the reason for concision is so that they have a chance to efficiently respond, and we don't have a lot of time. So if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll call on you, and then you'll get up and whatever. Okay, Geoff Hart. Speak loudly and stand up, please, my friend.
I enjoyed the conversation very much. I think the big question for me is there clearly does seem to be a trend in many countries away from Republican forms of government. There also seems to be, I agree with Yascha, that there is a rise in sort of populist ideology. We've had populist waves in the past, and they have tended to be sort of short on the whole. And the question, one other point that I think I want to make is about the importance of the 2007-2008 global financial crisis on very low growth and slow recovery from that. So the question is, if in fact we continue on this path to economic recovery, will there also be a short interlude of populism that will be followed by a better successor?
Great question. Let's have quick responses to that before we go to the next question.
I can jump in on that. I mean, I think one of the things that we see in the public opinion data is definitely the tension between support for democratic principles and then democracy not delivering. It's very clear in Latin America. Latin America, when we measured support for principles of democracy, one of the highest among the 38 countries among the regions that we measured. At the same time, the last 4 years have seen this dramatic decline in satisfaction with democracy, and now one of the lowest in terms of support for representative democracy. So economic challenges pose a real challenge for support for democracy if governments are not able to deliver on that. I think the other point is societies dealing with the challenge of a more diverse society is that they were not set up or ready to deal with, and we've seen that very much in Europe, that there are very negative attitudes about diversity, very negative attitudes about refugees and the impact they're going to have on their society, and this is the strongest correlate with support for the right-wing populist parties. Economics actually less so there. It's more about negative attitudes about refugees and worrying about their impact on your society.
So I mostly agree with the premise of a question, but not entirely, right? I mean, up till now, we've never had a populist as a president of the United States, at least not since the early to mid-19th century, right? So that's a big difference. And when you had these populist moments in the United States, they weren't connected to a big rise of what I would call the illiberal international, with very similar political figures rising in a whole set of countries around the world. When you look at the rise of populists in systems of proportional representation, where it's easier to see the rise because they register earlier.
Right.
That started before 2008. When you look at the curve, at the line in Europe, it's a pretty steady line since the 1990s that's just kept increasing, and 2008 is not an obvious inflection point. And the last thing I would say is that you see in many countries that populists are not a flash in the pan. that though you are right, that they don't tend to actually solve political problems, they have a talent for polarizing the political system in such a way and making everything about their supporters and their opponents that they don't leave the system. You see that in a country like Peru, where a populist leader was completely thrown out of politics, thrown into jail for very well-documented corruption, and has just been pardoned and is a very big part of politics again as of a few months ago. And you see that in a country like Italy, where Silvio Berlusconi had a terrible record of governance, where he was ousted from government in 2011. Thousands of people came out in the street, an amateur orchestra came together hastily in front of the presidential palace to give a rendition of Handel's Hallelujah. There was the mood in the country. In elections about a month ago, he came back into politics, is a kingmaker in Italian politics again, and there's two bigger populist movements that are in many ways much more scary, the Five Star Movement and the far-right xenophobic Northern League, which makes even the worst people who currently occupy the White House look like great liberal Democrats, who are now cumulatively having about 2/3 of the vote. So it is not at all guaranteed that populists will leave office because they don't have good government performance.
I'm going to let another question come and then prioritize you guys. I'm looking for some gender diversity, but I you know, like, yes, Sarah.
Thank you to the panelists for a really excellent discussion. I wanted to push us a little bit into a slightly different analytic frame, and this is pulling on Sergio's point of that one of the reasons for the demand for democratic deconsolidation is coming from a failure of current institutions to deliver on public good provisions and a problem of state capacity. And so I wonder if we can think a bit more capaciously about the demand for deconsolidation and use that to discuss a bit further what is fundamentally driving the failures of democratic institutions themselves in delivering stability and public goods, rather than just kind of focusing on this idea of, oh, people are feeling upset, and so now we have kind of a backlash against democratic institutions. And in particular, I would like to ask the panel if it is fruitful for us to shift our analytic gaze from the national to the subnational governance systems to understand these trends. I think particularly of the consolidation of executive authority among mayors, and that this is consistently valorized across the political spectrum. You know, cities will save us all. So what might we learn from the subnational, and how does that help us understand trends at the national level?
Let's start with Sergio, if you don't mind. Thank you, sir.
There are two issues that I think are interesting to discuss. One is the resiliency of formal democratic institutions. They are stronger than we think. And they're more entrenched sometimes in political culture than I mean, and sometimes you get surprises. Even in Peru, I mean, you have this huge crisis now, President Kuczynski resigning, but the transition was quite smooth, and it's not the first time. And you know, you may have some governance issues and instability, but at the end of the day, democracy works, right? Of course, it's not, you know, the kind of democracy we like, but you still have institutional stability. Although you may have specific crises that the system is able to absorb. We had this huge mess in Argentina. Well, we usually do that, right? But in 2001, right? 5 presidents in a week. But for Argentine standards, we respected the constitution, which is a very unusual thing, right? So you wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years we reconvene here and we talk about how, you know, democracy worked at the end of the day, better than what we expected, right? But you're right. Sometimes you have, in many cases, politics at the subnational level, local level, being stronger than ever, and having even the capacity to create new movements. Look at Barcelona and the Catalan movement. I mean, you have a thriving society trying to pursue independence, and you have a lot of mobilization and political parties and people engaged in politics And so, sometimes you look at democracy as a whole and you see crisis, but locally you see interesting cases of a new organization and all ways to create democracy working very nicely. And the last issue on the opposite side, right? When you look at the way populism works, guys, look, populism is very expensive. You need money, right? And this is actually financing through inflation or natural resources or expropriations and things like that. Democracy is cheaper than populism, right? And so you look at Venezuela. Venezuela, populism worked for a while when the price of oil was really high. Then you have the reverse cycle, and now populism is in a huge crisis. It's in disarray. And it's a humanitarian crisis, not just a political one, right? So the question is how you deliver money to the people. And this is the issue of clientelism, right? And this is a pretty complex set of mechanisms by which you have discretionary ways to pick who wins and who loses. So the impression I have is that this is stronger at the local level or at the state level than at the national level. Usually you have local bosses creating the kind of mechanisms that allow populist leaders to survive. And it takes a long while for those mechanisms to really settle. And poverty is an important issue. When you look at all the surveys, clearly poverty is highly correlated to the pervasiveness of populist clientelistic mechanisms.
I'd like to, before I go to you, I want to push you a little bit and maybe get you arguing a little bit with Yascha. So as I heard you just speak, there was a kind of functionalism in your account. The populist parties are fueled by discontent and the things that Yascha talked about, but they can't really succeed. They're too expensive, et cetera. And so it sounds like you're pretty, and you just talked about the long run, you're pretty confident that, that the institutions of democracy, liberal democracy, representative democracy, will be resilient enough to bounce back and restore a kind of equilibrium. I think Yascha is much more concerned about the ongoing political effects of these governments and movements in power. I'm also more concerned, I think, than you are. So I wonder if maybe you want to comment on that.
Yeah, one of the examples you gave is Venezuela. I agree with you that populism doesn't work very well. I agree with you that in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez was able to make great improvements for people for a few years because there was an oil boom and he spent all of the money. And then once the oil price dipped, it was a huge economic catastrophe. What's Venezuela looking like today? Were the democratic institutions greatly resilient and we have flourishing liberal democracy there today? Of course not. So I agree with you that populism doesn't work, but the problem is that people don't necessarily, there's a few problems. Once the populists have consolidated power, even when they have lost all popular support, as at this point they have largely done in Venezuela, it's very difficult for democratic forces to bounce back because then you have a consolidated democracy and it's difficult to win against those even if you have a majority of people on your side. That's problem number one. Problem number two is that even if people renounce a particular populist, they may not say, you know what, actually we were wrong, we should go back to respectable politicians who make sense and so on. They may say, well, you know what, turns out this guy was a phony. Perhaps we need to go for somebody who's even more extreme, or just somebody who has the same kind of political style, but who doesn't turn out to be a liar. And so you can get through these cycles of support for different kinds of populist movements, as we're seeing now in Italy. So I agree with your premise that populism doesn't deliver for the people, but I think it is frankly naive to assume that because it doesn't deliver for people, people will make these sort of rational calculations and return power to ordinary people. Let me just give you one quick more example on this. There's a great study by political scientists about the presidential elections during World War I. And what they show is that when Woodrow Wilson was running for re-election, they studied these bunch of New Jersey coastal towns. Why did they study them? Because some of them had experienced shark attacks, and some of them hadn't. That's what we call a natural experiment in social science. Now, nobody thinks that Woodrow Wilson decided which town to send the shark to and which town not to send the shark to. But the towns that had experienced shark attacks had a tailspin in their economy because tourists stayed away and so on and so forth, and fewer people voted for Woodrow Wilson in those towns than in the neighboring ones. Citizens don't always hold politicians accountable for what they're actually responsible for. They hold politicians accountable for how things are going, and they can often reward people for all kinds of random reasons. So right now, populists are pretty well set in the world because you know what? Even if you're governing pretty poorly in various ways in Hungary or Poland or the United States, but there's a big global recovery, you're probably going to get the reward for that.
By the way, Larry Bartels and Chris Agin wrote that piece, and they've developed it into a book called Democracy for Realists, which is getting a lot of attention. And
it's a great book.
Yeah. Michael?
No, I just was in response to your question about the failure of kind of democracies to deliver on kind of different fruits. I mean, I think obviously we've talked a lot about the economic side here and kind of the failure of established democracies to deliver broad economic growth for a broad cross-section of people, I think is obviously a major factor. But I also think the non-economic factors, which are extremely important. And I really think about this a lot. I mean, immigration, the failure of European and American governments over the last 30 years to really develop an established, orderly system for immigration, I think is one of the biggest contributors to this problem. And I was really struck, for instance, last week, when there was this discussion in Washington about a potential deal, the wall for DACA, it didn't happen. And putting aside the merits of it or the substance of it, I think if that had happened, I do wonder whether that would have been better off for the Democrats to lance this issue of this real concern among people that has been, in the Midwest and other places in Europe about, uncontrolled immigration. Not saying these feelings are totally correct, but I think that unless Democratic parties can address this, I think this populist surge will last quite a bit longer.
There's no fair way for me to call on people, by the way. And we have a limited amount of time. And the goal, I think, of all of this is to help nurture a really good conversation that we could all learn from. Having said that, I'm looking for a student. You had your hand up quick. Sorry, sorry, but I called on that guy.
So one widely accepted theory of international studies today is that of democratic peace theory, the idea that democracies don't go to war with each other generally. So I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on how the deconsolidation of democracy around the world might affect this theory and how it might affect the likelihood of international conflicts breaking out today.
Great question. Okay.
Well, I can say one thing on that.
Go ahead, and then we go across.
I mean, what I'm thinking about in response to your question is going back to a point I made at the beginning, which is the need for defenders of democracy to really make the case for why democracy and liberal democracy is the best way. I think, again, 30 years ago, I think that was a harder case to make. And I think, the research that you alluded to has been one of the, the points that people have made in defense of democracy. But I think, I believe in my heart that democracy, does promote peace, security, economic prosperity. But that case is harder and harder to make, I think, and it's not as believable. And I think one issue that we haven't really talked about today, the three big dislocations that Sergio mentioned, the fourth one would be the Iraq War. And I still think that in terms of the people who care a lot about democracy, that has really tarnished the idea of the promotion of democracy. I find that in a lot of my own conversations with younger people too. So I think we have to really make a stronger case for why democracy is the best form of government. And I think that case, I'd be really eager to hear how my colleagues would answer that question. But I think until we can make that case more strongly, I think democracy is going to have trouble.
So, look, I don't know how widely accepted the theory in fact is. I think there's a lively debate about it. And the reason for that has to do with a chicken. So if you bear with me for 1 minute, I want to tell you a story about a chicken. This is the kind of chicken we'd all like to eat for dinner these days. So it's local, it's organic, all of those kinds of things. But you know, it has a nice life, but the other animals on the farm warn it, and they say, hey, you know, be careful, the farmer only seems nice, one day he's going to come and kill it. And the chicken says, what are you talking about? The other, you know, the farmer's so nice to me, he feeds me every day, he mutters some encouraging words, why would he suddenly act so differently? Well, Bertrand Russell, who wrote the story, says in his nice British wit that one day the farmer does come to wring the chicken's neck, showing that more sophisticated views as to the uniformity of causation would have been to the chicken's benefit. Now, what's the point of this? The point of this is that in social science, we always have to think about scope conditions. That's the argument I make in my book about the causes of the crisis of liberal democracy, that there may have been these background conditions, like rapid improvements in living standards, right, a homogeneous society in certain ways, that made democracy so stable in the past, and that's why democracy may no longer be equally stable. Now, that's the same for democratic peace theory, right? It is a striking observation that there aren't any obvious cases of democracies going to war with each other, so there's some sort of borderline cases. But the question is, why was that? And the reason for that may have been that populations were really satisfied because things were going well for them in all kinds of ways. It may be because the United States was at least a democratic hegemon over the course of the Cold War, and then a global hegemon afterwards, right? So there may have been all kinds of background conditions which created that order and explained why democracy didn't go to war with each other, which go beyond just, hey, there were two democracies, right? So as we see increasingly truculent right-wing populists who are proudly saying, I only care about my country, it's not that you care about your country. Every good politician cares first of all about your country. Every good senator cares in many ways about their state. But it used to be that people saw that we have mutual interests. There's lots of things that are in your interest that's also in my interest. You now get the rise of politicians who say, no, when you're winning, I'm losing. And under those conditions, I wouldn't rely on the fact that democracies won't go to war with each other in the future just because they didn't go in the past. I think we don't have an empirically grounded answer to that question. We'll see.
Do you want to say anything to this, Katie?
I mean, I think one of the patterns that we're seeing in the public opinion data, we don't ask a lot about going to war and things like that, but we do ask about military strength and we do ask about global engagement. And you see populists in Europe are less likely to support global engagement. They really want to sort of retrench from the world. We also don't see a whole lot of appetite within Europe, say, to confront Russia militarily. So it'll be interesting to see in the future what this means. But if the populists stay in power or gain more power, there's not really an appetite among them, at least so far, among the people who support them, for strong global engagement or getting into military conflict with others. But that doesn't mean that won't arise at some point based on different conditions.
That's a very important point. Sergio, do you want to address this question?
Just one idea. You may have trade wars, currency wars before major confrontations, which is the usual thing when you look back in the 30s and last century. So you would expect those kind of confrontations beforehand.
Yes, the young woman there. And,
There's been recent discourse that liberal democracy might not actually be strong enough to stand up to populism in and of itself. So what reforms do you see that we need to make to our democracies now to make them strong enough to stand up to this threat?
Thank you. I was going to ask that question. Thanks. Cool. That's a great question. That might even, why don't each of you address that question? We'll start with you this time first.
Well, so I think it comes out of the analysis that I laid out about what the drivers of this populism are. I don't think you can answer that question without thinking about, well, why is it that we're in this mess, right? And then it seems to me that the answers, in my mind, are threefold. The first important thing is to actually make sure that people's living standards can increase. Sorry, I'm about to sneeze. That we explain to people that, yes, globalization is good, free trade is good. We want to defend those things because they're important for our country. And by the way, we've lifted 2 billion people around the world out of poverty in the last 20 or 30 years. But we can do much more to make sure that the fruits of that actually go to ordinary people. We've had economic growth in the last decades. It's just that the huge bulk of it has been captured by a tiny percentage of the population. That is partially because it's far too easy for rich people to hide their money in tax havens. And we can do much more to make it dangerous for people to break the law in those ways. It's partially because how much tax corporations pay depends on whether their headquarters in Indianapolis or in Delaware, right? It is partially because We don't do nearly enough to increase people's productivity. So we should invest much more in education, much more in lifelong learning and other things. And it's partially because even if people have a decent income, they have to spend so much of it on education, on health, and especially on housing. So those are ways in which we can actually change our policies to make it easier, for example, to build a ton more homes. Right? That's one piece, the economic piece. Showing people, the Brexit slogan was take back control, showing people that we can take back control without giving up on global engagement and free trade and so on and so forth, that we can put people in charge of what their destiny is. The second thing is around the cultural and identity issues. We currently have a political debate in which the far right tries to own nationalism and make it exclusive, make it exclusionary, victimize minorities and so on, and in which large parts from the left are scared of nationalism, either because they say we should give up on forms of collective identity altogether, or because they are so worried about, they are so invested in subnational identities, which they celebrate, to the exclusion of a nation. I think that's a mistake. I think we need an inclusive nationalism. We need to fight for what it means to be a patriot, to be a nationalist, in a way that, yes, defends anybody who's under attack, yes, defends minorities who are being excluded right now, proudly, without footnote, without limitation. But why? Because we share things with them, because we have things in common across racial and ethnic and religious divides, and that's what we're proud of. And thirdly, when it comes to social media and so on, I think we have to think about the ways in which we shouldn't censor from the government what can be said in those platforms. I think that's the wrong way to go. But we should fight for our values. We barely teach civics in schools anymore. In many universities, we talk incessantly about what's wrong with our countries, and there's plenty, and we should be upfront about that. We rarely talk about why it's better to live in the United States than it is to live in Venezuela or with China or Russia or Turkey. So we actually need to do much better education about why it is that for all of the shortcomings of our system, it is much better than other political systems, and we should be proud to defend it.
Thank you. We only have like 5.5 minutes left. I'm going to ask you guys, if you can, to try to keep yourselves to a minute. I want to try to wrap things up in 2 minutes. We're going to stay on time. There's no more time for questions. Thanks. Yeah. What are we going to do? But though there's plenty of time for questions in life, just not here. Take courses at here and other places at IU. 1 minute each. Yeah.
Sure. So we don't make recommendations on reform, so I can't really talk through that. But I think if you are interested in thinking about that question, is looking at, as you said, sort of what are the underlying factors that lead to support for populism or concerns about democracy. And I think we've talked about that at great length here, but it is the economy and how people feel about how things are going, but then also other stressors on society, like suddenly having a lot more immigrants or refugees and what that means for national identity and what that means for people's concerns about either the economy or safety. And so one of the interesting things we found in 2016 was that Northern European countries were very concerned about refugees' impact on the chance of terrorism or crime in their countries. And Southern European countries were very concerned about the impact of refugees on their economy. So I think understanding sort of what are the underlying factors of people's support either for populism or lack of support for representative democracy will help answer that question.
Experience counts, and sometimes you need to deal with populism for a while to become a real Democrat, right? So probably it's not a bad idea to have these sort of crazy experiences just to strengthen your own values.
I don't have a magic bullet for you. I think of two issues just to kind of, that we probably didn't really address today, but just to put them on the table. One is the withdrawal of U.S. leadership in the, from strong support of democracy and human rights. By the way, that didn't start on January 20th, 2017. Yeah. So I think we need to be honest about that. But I think that the U.S. has clearly, made mistakes. But if the U.S. is withdrawing from support of these values, then I think it's going to be very hard for the global cause of freedom to advance. So I think that's just one issue that I feel very, very strongly about. The other issue is, just the changing media ecosystem in our country right now. And I don't really have an answer for this, but I'm deeply concerned about, as a former journalist, about the polarization around. I think we have a very robust and free press in this country, but really, at the end of the day, the ultimate check on government power is the media. And if 50%, Katie can correct me if I'm wrong, but 50% of people believe a certain news source over really authoritative information. That's a problem. So kind of the undermining of like a fact-based media, I think, is something that I don't know the answer to, but I think it's going to have to be part of the solution going forward.
Thank you. So we have 2 minutes, and I'm going to take the 2 minutes, 2 minutes and 30 seconds, to try to wrap things up and bring things together in a way that looks forward to the rest of this 2-day conference. And so I want to thank everybody. I'd like to make 3 points. One is a point about the different dimensions of this question of, let's say, the crisis of liberal democracy. And many of them have been addressed here today. There's what we might call the global or geopolitical dimension of this, the regional dimension, which we've talked about a little bit, but not that much, having to do with the EU. The New York Times had a really interesting piece about this yesterday. The national level, the subnational level, but also what we might call, I think, the transnational level. And actually, the comments that you made about Freedom House go to that. So one question is whether liberal democratic states, whether the leaders of liberal democratic states will work together to support liberal democracy. Another question is to what extent are there cross-border ties between citizens and citizen groups and social movements that are also working in support of liberal democracy. So that's one set of questions. And this entire conference is about America's role in the world, which is partly about this. It's not only about the question of democracy, but it's partly. So that's one issue. The second has to do with the relationship between populism and democracy. And we've talked about them here more or less as if they are in tension and perhaps even in contradiction with each other. And certainly I would say the dominant forms of populism in our world are in contradiction to liberal democracy, and which is a major theme of Yascha's book and many other important works on this topic. At the same time, it's important to make, I think, 2 important clarifications. One is that there are different forms of populism. They're not the same. This came out, by the way, to some extent in the discussion of the American elections. Is Bernie a populist? Well, maybe he is. He's not a populist like Trump is a populist. And the second issue that I think needs clarification is that there are illiberal and non-liberal conceptions of democracy. And Yascha talked a little bit about this. When we ask people whether they like democracy, that doesn't necessarily mean they like liberal democracy. And part of the challenge of liberal Democrats is to present plausible understandings of liberal democracy to people who believe in democracy but don't believe in liberalism. And this leads me to my third very quick point, which has to do with a question that Isaiah Berlin posed many decades ago about Nazism, actually, in a discussion of value neutrality in social science. He asked, is it possible to present a value-neutral description of Nazism? Here we are in an academic context, and we're not here as activists, and we're here taking very seriously intellectual and academic inquiry. At the same time, it's really interesting to me that we've been talking about the danger of authoritarian populists and been very careful about saying stuff like, we don't want to be partisan, okay? Whereas, in fact, the subtext of at least some of what we've been saying is there are political leaders in our world. I think for many of the people on this panel, though Katie is agnostic, there are political leaders in this world, including the current president of the United States, who figure very significantly in this entire academic and scholarly discussion about the crisis of democracy as dangers. What do we do with that? Can we say that? How do we say that in a serious academic and scholarly way? Can we afford not to say that? Put yourself back in 1931. Hitler's very interesting. He's a very interesting leader. I don't want to be partisan or say anything negative about that party. Now, obviously, the Hitler card is a card that's often used to obscure. But the question that Yascha is posing in his book, that a lot of these reports are posing, and that Levitsky and Zeibat are posing in their book, How Democracies Die, is, are there forces in our world that are actually threatening democracy? How can we describe them without naming them? And I think that's something for us to think more about. I thank you very much. I thank Lee and this entire effort, his staff, and this school, and I wish you a good day.